Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Why Microsoft Office 365 Latest Data Protection Enhancements Just Aren't Enough. Today's event is brought to you by Druva and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis and I'm excited to be your moderator for today's event. Before we get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping here we need to cover. First off, we want this to be a very educational event. If you have questions about data protection and Office 365, now is the time to ask them because we have an expert presenter on today's event who I will introduce in just a moment to ask those questions about data protection. Use the questions box there in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer all of your questions during the event as well as during a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the event. Now, we also have a $300 Amazon gift card to give away to one lucky attendee on today's live event. If the live event has already passed and you're watching this on demand, I'm sorry the drawing has already occurred. If you'd like to find out the full Legalese prize terms and conditions for that prize drawing, you can visit events.actualtechmedia.com and click on prize terms and conditions. And now I'm honored to introduce today's expert presenter. That is Curtis Preston, Chief Technologist at Druva. I've known Curtis for many years, and most people know him as Mr. Backup because of the many years he spent evangelizing data protection. So I'm very happy to have Curtis on the event. And with that, take it away, Curtis.
So good morning, afternoon, whatever it happens to be where you're at. We're going to talk about Office 365 and the ways that it can protect itself and why really, in the end, a lot of people don't feel that that is sufficient and why you need a third-party system. So first off, I just want to say, criticizing Office 365's limitations is, I don't want to say is not the same as criticizing Office 365. We're fans. We use Office 365 as a company, and discussing limitations that it has, I think it's just acknowledging a reality that no product does everything. So first off, there's two sort of broad categories that I'll put the native protection features into. And first, I'm sort of generalizing them and calling them the recycle bin, right, which is basically sort of how it reacts. And the native protection features, they're different. One of the problems with those features, the recycle bin type features, are that they're inconsistent across the product, right? So, you've got, 14 days for user and exchange, 30 days for an admin, that's an exchange. In SharePoint, it's, it's up to 90 days. Things depend on the number of versions, and it's just different across the platform. But the real concern with those, with the native features, is that the admins can actually purge things, right? And one of the things that we do as data protection people is that you're protecting against everything and everybody, right? There are rogue admins. They do happen. There continue to be news stories of rogue admins that do things, and sometimes when you have a rogue person and they have administrative privileges, you have to be worried about what they can do within the product. And so all of the recycle bin sort of category features, admins can work around all of those, right? And so if you do have a black hat within your organization, or something that a lot of people don't think of, if the system itself gets hacked, if someone gains administrator privileges, right? Someone gets a hold of someone's username and password, manages to defeat, two-factor authentication, and does manage to gain access to the account as an admin, they can do these things like delete data. Not only can they delete data in emails, they can delete the recycle bin versions of those same emails. And so there's a lot of different areas that aren't, protected by that recycle bin, right? Just different things that can happen. And again, one of the things is also this idea, if the SaaS service either ends, like if you end the contract, if you end the contract with Microsoft, obviously the features built into the product no longer apply. So if you decide to go from Office 365 to G Suite, for example, or vice versa, you can't bring your data with you because you use the built-in data protection features, right? And then, I've already talked about malicious deletion and things like if there is some sort of, accidental override or anything like that, depending on how things are configured, either accidentally or maliciously, you may end up losing data that you didn't intend on losing. So the other thing about the built-in features, right? So when you look at the recycle bin for the various versions of the recycle bin for Exchange, there is no point-in-time restore of a mailbox. Now, why might that be required, right? So if there's some sort of hack or deletion or a rogue employee who leaves and deletes all of their emails, there is no point-in-time restore of a mailbox. And this isn't immediately obvious, right? So if you can sort of, assuming that the user and or admin didn't delete the stuff that's in the recycle bin, you could put everything that's back in the recycle bin, but you can only put everything back. You can't put it back to a point in time, right? So you can either restore individual emails or you can restore everything that's there back to the thing. There's nothing in that system that tracks what emails were there or not there on a particular point in time, right? Which is a really important thing to do. It's just a basic backup and recovery concept of being able to restore a file system or an email box or anything like that back to a particular point in time. When you think about SharePoint and OneDrive, they have added some features relatively recently where an individual user can restore their entire SharePoint account, right? So a user can restore their OneDrive account where they basically put the files back to the way they looked yesterday, sort of a point-in-time restore of that account, that user. What it can't do is it can't restore part of that user, right? So you can restore a file, so you can dumpster dive, as I call it, to go through the recycle bin and find files that you need, or you can restore that entire user. What you can't, for example, if, let's say, you get a ransomware attack and it only happens to go after a particular subfolder of a large user's folder, you can't restore just that subfolder, right? You have to restore the entire user, and anything they've worked on between, now and whenever the last time SharePoint took a backup, any of that data will be gone. Okay. The next thing, and I think this is a really important thing, again, I've spent my career helping people to protect their data, and there is something that we call the 3-2-1 rule. And using the recycle bin as a recovery mechanism, as well as the other stuff we're going to talk about here in just a minute, it violates the 3-2-1 rule. What is that? 3 copies of your data on at least 2 pieces of media, one of which is off-site. You're protecting a computer with the computer. It's the equivalent of backing up the files on your hard drive to another folder on your hard drive. It's just a basic violation of the concept of the 3-2-1 rule, and which is my overarching issue with how data is generally protected in Office 365. So there is something, and this is really what I was aiming at when I came up with this idea of this webinar with the title, with the recent enhancements are still not enough. When I first heard about retention policies, I, possibly like you, looked at them and said, well, gee, it looks like, Microsoft has addressed many of the issues that I mentioned previously. So it is possible to make sure that every email and every file and every version of every file is stored for whatever period of time you want it stored for. You can say, I want every email and every version of every file to be stored for 3 years, and you can actually push a button that says, and don't let me change my mind, and don't let anybody else change my mind. So if you enact that, you will store every email and every version of every file for whatever period of time you specify. And you go, well, gee, there you go. I have backup, right? I have all of the files and all of the emails, It addresses the rogue admin concern that you had in the recycle bin method. And the good news is that your data is somewhere, right? So if you get a ransomware attack, if a rogue admin deletes a bunch of data, or a rogue user or whatever, your data is stored somewhere. The bad news is getting it back will be difficult or impossible, okay? And this is especially in the case of a large ransomware attack. As hopefully you are aware, ransomware has become a huge thing in a lot of environments, and it often attacks many users at the same time. And once one user within an organization gets ransomware, it can easily spread to many other users using, for example, the RDP protocol. But here's the real, sort of the crux of this issue. The retention policies use, when you want to get things back, that the retention policies stored. It uses an e-discovery workflow, not a backup and restore workflow. This is really important to me because I spent a majority of my career explaining to people that backups aren't archives, right? That a really old backup is just that, it's a really old backup. Well, now what we have is we have an archive or an e-discovery type storage device that is pretending to be a backup, right? So why does that matter? Well, e-discovery is just not meant to do the same thing, right? So for example, the most obvious thing is that it doesn't do point-in-time restore, right? So you can't, the same thing that I mentioned before that is true of the recycle bin, you can't do a point-in-time restore of either Exchange or OneDrive. What you can do is search for, files and, emails that match a certain pattern, and then you can create a download of those files. And I've got a bunch of images here of the way this e-discovery workflow. So it starts with opening up a case, and then once you create a case, you have to give that case a name, and you have to specify what, where are we going to get things from. You end up with, basically this is a several process workflow just to create the initial query to look for things. And then once you find, you create this, if you think about how this works, it makes perfect sense when you think about an e-discovery situation, because you get a lawsuit and the lawsuit has a name. So you create a search based on that lawsuit, right? So, you've been accused of stealing intellectual property about a product, and so you have to search for a given string, right? And so you create the case by the name of the lawsuit, and then you do a number of searches for various phrases that match that case, and then that creates a download, which you then download and you give to the attorneys. That's what an e-discovery is, but it's really, you look at all of these steps required to create one download, and you would have to do this per user, and then what you have is you now have essentially the equivalent of a PST file that you would then have to upload for that user per user, and you have to do it for OneDrive, you have to do it for Exchange. It's just, this is what I mean by, the good news is that the data is there, right? But it's not easy to get all of this back, right? The e-discovery workflow was designed to find a needle in the haystack. It's not designed to put the haystack back. Hopefully that makes sense, right? I would just say this: if anybody thinks that retention policies will help them in the case of a large DR situation, either a DR situation or a ransomware attack situation, I would say go try it. First make sure you have an account that has e-discovery privileges, which again requires additional privileges. Use that account and work through this process. It's many, many steps to create a single download for a single user, and you have to do that for every single user, first for Exchange, then for OneDrive, right? And you'll have, dozens or hundreds of cases depending on how big of a scenario you have. I just think that all of these are really designed for oops, right? And the retention policies are more designed for e-discovery. They're not designed for restore, right? A third-party tool can do all of these things, right? So let me just talk about, in the remaining time I have left, let me talk about Druva. So Druva is the only cloud-native data protection product that handles both laptops, SaaS services like Office 365, as well as data centers and cloud resources, right? Cloud-native resources. We've got over 4,000 customers, over 100 petabytes under management in S3, and that's a deduped number I always mention, right? That actually represents a much larger customer, or much larger number of data from our customers. We're in the top 5 Amazon storage partner, and 10% of the Fortune 500 companies use our product. So basically, we are a cloud-native product. We run in AWS. We attach various things. We attach to various things, right, from endpoints to, G Suite, Office 365, et cetera. And then we back up. We do a variety of services from those data sets. Specifically with regards to Office 365, it's a cloud-to-cloud connection, right? So you specify, you give our SaaS services the appropriate administrator access, and the data gets backed up directly from Office 365 to our cloud in AWS. And that means that there's no impact to your network bandwidth. It also means that you've got easy access and on-demand recovery, even if Office 365 is offline, right? So that's something that I always like to mention. They don't have they don't have outages very often, but when they happen, you can get access to your data while they are offline. And you can also archive data for as long as needed, either for compliance, or litigation, or in the case of an exiting employee, you can hold on to their data for as long as you need to. And you can view all of that data and manage it all in a single dashboard. So the flexible restore options, you can either restore in place, which is the way the default things work in Office 365, or unlike the tools in Office 365, you can restore it as a copy. So you can restore one user's data to another user's account, et cetera, right? And also, users are able to access their backed up data from any device, right? So including their mobile device, because we have an agent that can run on your iPhone or your Android, for example. This is just a quick snapshot of what the unified dashboard looks like. You get to see all of your devices. If you're backing up laptops, all of the users protected in Office 365 and any other SaaS providers that you would happen to be using. And you can see here, for example, on the right side, you can see that there's 37 terabytes of data being stored in the cloud, which is representing actually 90 terabytes of data, right? So that's just and by the way, this unified dashboard is actually part of a more global unified dashboard that also can protect your data center or your cloud native workloads, right? Today, we're just mainly talking about Office 365. So the key takeaway here, I think, is to mention that the Office 365 data is protected, as well as when we think about Office 365. Let me just sort of circle back to the beginning, right? This idea of the 3-2-1 rule. I think Office 365 is a great product, and it could be the best product in the world, and I would still not trust the database behind Office 365 to back up the data for Office 365. You just think about any other database in the world and whether or not you would do that. You would not back up an Oracle database to another table within that Oracle database. And that's essentially what you're doing when you use any of the native data protection features within Office 365. You are using the service to back up the service, right? There is not an additional service, right, Another thing, and I can't believe I didn't put this on a slide. If you're on the fence here and you're not sure whether or not, Microsoft, maybe I'm making all of this up, right? Maybe they have great SLAs for backup and they'll meet those SLAs. Here's your biggest surprise, and that is that there are no SLAs around backup and recovery. Go take a look, right? Go take a look at your service agreement with Microsoft. There are SLAs for everything like availability, for things like that, right? They have an agreement with you that they will keep the service available, right? So that the Office 365 service will be online and available for your use. Some have interpreted that to mean, well, that means that my data will be available. No, there's nothing in there about your data being made available. That's about the Office 365 service being available, which is a very different thing than your data being available. And just this idea that there are no SLAs for that, and that the built-in sort of recycle bin features can be defeated by a rogue admin, and the new retention policies, which I think are great, are really aimed at e-discovery and not aimed at operational recovery, right? And when you get a large ransomware infection that happens to bleed over into OneDrive because people are syncing their folders from their laptops, these features will not be very helpful in that situation, right? But instead, you could use Druva's tool to make sure that Office 365 data is protected, as well as, if you would like, we can also protect the data on the end user's device as well. And then unify all of that into a single repository for better compliance and also for e-discovery. We do support a full e-discovery workflow, and you can meet any of the data retention requirements that you've got by, you might have some regulations or there might be rules within your organization. You can meet all of those data retention requirements with our product as well. Here are a couple of URLs to learn more about Druva InSync. I guess I didn't mention the name of the product that we're talking about in question is Druva InSync. That is our end user data protection solution, so that protects laptops and SaaS products like this. So with that, we can take questions from the audience. Haley, I don't know if we have any questions.
All right, thank you, Curtis. I think we have a couple of questions here. The first one is, where is all the Office 365 data backed up?
So we are a service that runs in AWS, and we separate data and metadata, right? We do that for a couple of reasons. One is that metadata is more of a database type storage, and data is done in object storage. So we separate data and metadata. The data itself gets stored in S3. If you're archiving and keeping data for longer periods of time, some of that data will get migrated by your option out to services like Glacier. The metadata is actually stored in DynamoDB, which is a separate AWS service. And that, as I said, by separating the data and metadata, and of course also the fact that we encrypt the data before it leaves your organization and then encrypts it again using AES 256 and stores that in S3, there are multiple safeguards between S3 and any publicly facing interface, which would not allow anyone to even access your S3 data. But even if they were to break through every, we have like 5 different layers of protection before you get to S3, even if they were able to get that, what they would get is 100% encrypted data that they would not be able to even put together without the use of the metadata, which is stored in a completely different service. So there you go. I guess that's a short answer to that question.
All right, and then one more question. Can Druva help with ransomware?
Yes. So we, on the side of the house where we are backing up end user data, We have an optional service that uses machine learning to watch for patterns in terms of, just an example, a given user backs up X number of megabytes of data per day, and then suddenly they backed up 10 gigabytes, right? What happened? Why did they do that? That would set off an alarm, which would send a notification to an administrator, and would immediately pause the backups. And then the administrator can remediate that if they find out that this was indeed a ransomware. The first thing they would do is search for that data. They would be able to delete it off of the end user device as well as out of the backups. And then we would recommend that they wipe that device, reinstall, and then do a complete restore of data that's been backed up from that device. And so basically we still believe that you should have an intrusion detection system and monitor that sort of stuff to look for and stop ransomware wherever possible. But we can be your last line of defense and notice if you have been infected by seeing changes in patterns, and then helping you remediate as necessary.
Thank you, Curtis. Thanks for answering all those questions. I'm afraid that's all the time we have on today's event. If you have a question that wasn't answered, I encourage you just to email sales@druva.com, and they will be glad to answer all of your questions. Also, check out the free Druva trial over at druva.com. And with that, you can easily give Druva a try for yourself. You can also request a product demo or learn more about the Druva InSync product, again, at druva.com. I want to thank you, Curtis, for joining us on today's event. Thank you, Druva, for sponsoring. And thank you so much for all the attendees who took time out of their day to join us on today's event. I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. And with that, it's now time to announce our prize winner.
The winner of today's $300 Amazon gift card is Tyler Davis of Ohio. Congratulations, Tyler Davis of Ohio. You are the big winner on today's event. If you are not Tyler Davis of Ohio, or you're watching this on demand and the event has already occurred, of course, you can sign up for future events at events.actualtechmedia.com. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's event. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. Have a great day.